Hey, Guitar Nerd is here with another video on Elden Ring. Today we will be covering 7 different frost weapons as well as my top 3 recommendations for dishing out fire damage which can be used to quickly reset frostbite procs. As a side note, just be aware that my level as well as what armor I use varies between the different builds that I cover in this video due to the weight differences between the weapons and how long it took me to test out all of these ice builds. That aside though, I would at least recommend using the Snow Witch hat to increase the damage of cold sorceries by 10%, but the Spellblade set is also a good option if you don't mind the lower defense to increase the damage from cold Ashes of War and skills by 2% per armor piece. Otherwise, whatever armor you prefer is completely fine too. As far as my level goes, it may vary anywhere from 150 to 220 in between these clips, but I would mainly recommend having intelligence up to 68 if you want to use cold sorceries like Rennie's Dark Moon. Having faith up to at least 19 would be good to use Fire's Deadly Sin and other Fire Monk incantations, but you may want to consider increasing it to 25 if you want to use Golden Vow, or up to level 42 if you want to be able to use all of the fire incantations. I'll be sure to mention the stat requirements for each weapon I cover though, but you can always use my character as a reference for other skill level recommendations if needed. For talismans, I generally at least use the Shard of Alexander to boost the attack power of skills by 15% and the Fire Scorpion Charm to increase fire damage by 12%, but it does also increase physical damage taken by 10% too, so the Dragon Crest Great Shield can be a good combo for it to reduce physical damage taken by 20% to balance it out. Obviously, feel free to change these out as you see fit, but I'd recommend the Graven Mask Talisman or the Phlox Canvas Talisman to increase spell damage by 8% if you plan on using sorceries or incantations. Radagon's Icon is also a good option if you're using any spells to shorten spell casting. And if you do plan on going the mage route, then for the Flask of Wondrous Physic, I'd still recommend using the Magic Shroud and Crack tier for boosting magic attacks by 20%, as well as the Cerulean Hidden tier to get rid of any FP consumption for 15 seconds. But if you want to focus on fire damage more, then swapping one of these out with the Flame Shroud and Crack tier may be a good option to increase fire attacks by 20% as well. Aside from that, the last Frost build I cover also uses Blood Loss, so the equipment I use there is a good bit different, but I'll be sure to cover all of that in more detail in that section. Now that our equipment is good to go, let's dive into some cold sorceries and fire incantations. To start, my top recommended cold sorceries are Dual-Wield Moonblade, Rennie's Dark Moon, and Glintstone Iceberg, especially when coupled with the Snow Witch hat. Generally, I tend to use Terra Magica for a 35% magic buff, Flame Grant Me Strength for a 20% buff to physical and fire damage, as well as Golden Vow for another 15% damage buff. Using Bestial Vitality or other healing incantations are always a good option when using Fire's Deadly Sin to set yourself on fire in order to quickly reset frostbite procs. Obviously, there are plenty of fire incantations that could be used instead though, so don't be afraid to experiment some if you want. If you'd like to try out some ice incantations as well, then I'd recommend Borealis' Mist given how much damage it can do. As you'll see though, I tend to prefer to start my fights with Rennie's Dark Moon after applying all of my buffs, and although Dual-Wield Moonblade and Glintstone Iceberg are always great options for building up Frostbite too, I generally enjoy using my weapon skills instead for doing most of my other frost and fire damage. Speaking of which, if you prefer using an Ash of War to do fire damage, then I'd highly recommend the Flame of the Redmanes. This is essentially the fire version of the Hoarfrost Stomp, but it also deals 40 stance damage, so it is actually capable of stunning many large enemies in 2 hits, and with repeated uses, it can stun most bosses in the game too. To get it, just go to the front of the Fort Jail Site of Grace, where it is dropped by an invisible teardrop scarab. However, my personal favorite option to use for fire damage is the Magma Blade. This thing cranks out a lot of fire damage very quickly, especially with its Magma Shower weapon skill. It does require 16 Faith, 15 Dexterity, and 9 Strength, and only has about a 1% drop rate, but it is well worth it given how much damage it can do and how well it combos with many of the ice weapons I cover in this guide. If you're curious, you'll need to farm it by defeating the Man Serpent enemies wielding the orange Magma Blade at the Volcano Manor. Thankfully, 2 of the serpents can be easily accessed by going up the wooden elevator outside of the building to the north of the Temple of Iglay, Site of Grace. One is through the first archway to the right, and the other one is further down the hallway. If you want something that hits harder though, then the Blasphemous Blade may be what you're looking for. It does require 22 strength, 21 faith, and 15 dexterity, but it not only packs a punch, but it can also heal you when using its weapon skill Taker's Flames, or when you defeat an enemy while having it equipped. As a side note, the fire damage from the weapon skill only scales with faith, but if you want to snag this one, then just be sure to give the Remembrance of the Blasphemous to Enya at the Round Table Hold after defeating Record. Now that we have covered some great fire options, let's take a closer look at our frost weapons, starting with the noble Slender sword with the Hoarfrost Stomp Ash of War, which is one of the easiest ways to inflict frostbite damage on enemies. Thankfully, this Ash of War is easy to get, and you've got two options to get it to. You can either get the Ash of War itself in Liurnia at the Lakes from the invisible teardrop scarab by the shallow body of water southeast of the Caria Manor, or you can get it from the Ice Rhine Hatchet, which is located within a chest inside of a ruined bell tower southeast of the Temple Quarter Site of Grace. Although you could use the axe instead, I would actually recommend spending the time needed to farm for the noble Slender sword, since it is one of the longest straight swords in the game and can provide a good bit of extra range over the axe, and has C scaling with dexterity instead of D scaling. The drop rate for it is low at 0.5% though, so it may take some time, but there are at least a couple of different farming spots you can use to make it a bit easier too. The first location you can use is from the group of wandering nobles near the Troll-Pulled Carriages Caravan to the west of Waypoint Ruins. If you're able to use anything like the Sacred Relic Sword where you can wipe out all of the enemies quickly, then it should speed the process up some. Just be sure to use some silver pickled foulfoots and any armor that you may have that can boost your item discovery more too, but if this location doesn't do the trick, then you can also try the pair of nobles that are just chilling outside of the schoolhouse classroom site of Grace within the Ray Ilicaria Academy. Now if you don't want to use the Hoarfrost Stomp Ash of War or farm the Slender sword, then my next recommendation would be to go for the Zamor curved sword, especially if you are a fan of the larger weapons, since this one falls under the curved greatsword category. It does require 16 strength and 18 dexterity, but its Zamor Ice Storm weapon skill is well worth it given how much damage it can quickly do. It can also break your enemy's poise after landing a couple of hits with it too. The best part about it though is if you use Fire's Deadly Sin with it, you'll be able to very quickly apply multiple procs Frostbite with ease. And even if you are able to get any critical hits in, you're probably better off just spamming this attack when you're still on fire because of all the damage it pumps out. So if you want to snag this one, just head over to the Giant Conquering Hero's grave and defeat the ancient hero Zamor that's found at the end of the dungeon. Another fun option to consider is the Dragonscale Blade. This one requires 20 dexterity and 12 strength, but it has C dexterity scaling with the Ice Lightning sword weapon skill that allows you to not only shoot down a bolt of ice lightning on your enemy, but it also leaves the blade coated with extra lightning damage and frostbite buildup for the next 20 seconds. And given that this is considered a katana, you can consider dual wielding it with other katanas too. In fact, I may test out some builds myself to see what works best, so don't forget to subscribe if you're curious to follow along. But if you want this katana, all you have to do is defeat the Dragonskin Soldier in the Lake of Rot, and then you should be good to go. If katanas or curved greatswords don't float your boat, then you could always try out the Clayman's Harpoon. This weapon may not sound too appealing at first, but once you pair it with the Ice Spear Ash of War, you'll quickly realize how much damage it can really dish out. The spinning motion it does at the beginning of the attack does ice damage too, so if you time it right or pair it with some cold sorceries, you'll be able to quickly get those frostbite procs off without much trouble at all. In fact, I'm usually able to apply frostbite within even a couple of throws right after using Rennie's Darkmoon spell, and if you get enough hits in, you'll make your enemies vulnerable for a critical attack too. To get the Ice Spear Ash of War, you'll need to defeat the Knights Cavalry patrolling near the Broken Gate Town Bridge in the Lakes of Liurnia. The Clayman's Harpoon is a bit easier to get since it's just dropped by any of the Claymen at the Yule Palace ruins. It apparently has a 2% drop rate, but there are so many Claymen at these locations that it shouldn't take too long to farm it either. Another great option is of course the Death Poker. It only requires 15 strength, 17 dexterity, and 11 intelligence to wield this greatsword, and the main thing that makes it unique is the Ghost Flame Ignition weapon skill that deals magic damage with frostbite buildup. Despite its name, it does not deal any fire damage, and the weapon itself has frost buildup of 65. But the really cool thing about it is that you can follow up with a light attack to spread the flame out in a line of direction of your choosing, or you can follow up with a heavy attack to do a larger explosion of damage. While it may take some practice to get used to it, this is one of the most flexible weapon skills in my opinion because it can allow you to do some serious damage if you're able to successfully predict your enemy's movements. So be sure to snag this one up by defeating the Deathrite bird that appears at nighttime southeast of the southern Ionia Swampbank site of Grace. If this Greatsword isn't big enough for you, then how about a Colossal Sword? It will require 26 strength, 18 dexterity, and 22 intelligence, but if you don't mind the stat requirements, then I'd highly encourage you try out the Royal Greatsword. Aside from its heavy hitting attacks, the Wolf's Assault weapon skill is what makes this weapon so great. There's just something about leaping up into the air, plunging your sword into your opponent, and causing an explosion of frostbite that is really satisfying. The amount of damage you can do with this thing when you land both hits from this skill is just ridiculous too. Pair it with Fire's Deadly Scent and you'll be doing even more damage too with the additional frostbite procs. It is a little bit of a longer animation to go through, but its damage with its hyper armor definitely makes up for it. So to get it, you will need to defeat Blythe as part of Ranni's questline once he spawns in front of Ranni's Rise Tower. Last but not least is what I'd consider to be probably my favorite ice build in this whole guide, and that's because we are not only doing blood loss build up with it, but we are also dual wielding curved swords with the Magma Blade. So we are essentially constantly building up blood loss and frostbite at all times while doing a good amount of fire damage to go along with it. And that's without having to constantly switch out weapons or use any spells or skills to use fire damage to reset the procs of frostbite too. So we already have the Magma Blade and the Hoarfrost Stomp Ash of War if you followed along earlier in the video. The last main weapon to tie this all together is the Scavenger's Curved Sword. While it may only have a blood loss build-up of 45, it only requires 14 dexterity and 9 strength, and can be easily obtained by looting it off of a corpse near the Gratis Scion by the bridge northwest of the first Mount Gelmer campsite site of Grace. Once you have the sword, just slap the Hoarfrost Stomp Ash of War on it with the Cult Affinity, and you should be good to go. This may bring its blood loss buildup down to 38, but it will now cause frost buildup of 105, so we really don't even have to focus on spamming the Hoarfrost Stomp Ash of War with this build either. Obviously, to get the most use out of this build, we'll want to change our equipment a good bit. For starters, we can swap out the Snow Witch hat with the White Mask, and for talismans, I'd recommend at least using the Fire Scorpion Charm, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, and the Rotten Wings Sword Insignia. You can always use Millicent's Prosthesis as well to raise your attack power with successive attacks even more too if you want, but here I'm actually using the Green Turtle Talisman instead to help with the stamina recovery speed. We can also use the Flame Shrouding and Thorny Crack Tears in our Flask of Wondrous Physic to boost our attack power even more too. And now that we have all of that set up, we can use Golden Vow for another 15% damage buff and Flame Grant Me Strength for a 20% buff to physical and fire damage. So if you use all of this, then you should be melting through bosses in no time. If for some reason none of these options are up your alley, then the Dark Moon Greatsword is of course another great option I would recommend considering. I actually already covered this one in great detail in one of my previous OP guide videos though, so be sure to check it out if you're interested. Likewise, the Frozen Needle is another frost weapon option, but unfortunately I was not sold on it enough myself to actually recommend it for getting the procs of frostbite done as quickly. There's also the Chilling Mist Ash of War that you can use with all sorts of weapons, so that could be more worthwhile, but just keep in mind the frost coating it applies on the weapon only lasts for 20 seconds, so hopefully you'll find the options I've laid out here in this guide to be more helpful overall. I do hope to experiment with more dual-wielding Fire Frost Blood builds though, so be sure to subscribe if you'd like to follow along, and feel free to comment below if you think I may have missed anything, or just want to see me cover any other options. But until next time, happy gaming!